David Miller wasn't the kind of man to pick a fight, but he sure as hell knew how to finish one. At 58, he had seen more than his share of red tape, property lines, zoning disputes, and the quiet politics of land ownership in California. A retired county land inspector, David had returned to Pine Lake not to wage war, but to find peace. The cabin his father built in the 1980s, nestled among whispering pines and glassy waters, had long stood as a monument to simpler times. His inheritance wasn't just a cabin, it was a legacy. A promise of quiet mornings, the smell of pine and lake water, and maybe a slow return to a life without clipboards, code books, and planning meetings. But peace, as David would learn, is sometimes guarded by the wrong people. At first glance, Pine Lake was everything you'd expect from a tucked-away mountain community. 50 acres of scenic woodland, ringed by rustic homes, and a stretch of dirt road that coiled like a sleeping snake around the lake itself. Many residents were retirees, people like David, who wanted nothing more than to fish, breathe, and maybe strike up a conversation at the community barbecue pit every other Saturday. It was calm. Too calm, some might say. That kind of tranquility often masks deep fractures beneath the surface. The trouble began not long after David moved back in. His first mistake, as far as anyone could tell, was not a mistake at all, just a sunflower. He planted it near his porch, a splash of gold against the cabin's cedar siding. But within days, he received a typed letter slipped under his door, signed by the HOA president, Margaret Thompson. The letter was oddly formal for such a trivial thing. It stated that unauthorized alterations to visible landscaping violated Pine Lake HOA regulations under Section 3.4b of the Community Guidelines. David stared at the single sunflower, then back at the letter. At first, he chuckled. It seemed too ridiculous to be real. But when he politely called Margaret to clear up the confusion, he was met with something far colder than bureaucracy. He met the first flicker of control masked as order. Margaret Thompson had only moved into Pine Lake 5 years earlier, yet she had swiftly risen to dominate the HOA with the iron grip of someone who interpreted regulations as weapons. Widowed, childless, and sharp-tongued, she had the demeanor of a woman who had spent her life being overlooked and now found herself in a position of influence she had no intention of relinquishing. She was meticulous and relentless, quoting obscure clauses like scripture and hounding residents for the smallest infractions. A bird feeder placed too close to a walkway. A car parked an inch over the gravel border. A garden gnome painted, too brightly, in her words. These were not violations of community harmony. They were excuses for control. David's sunflower became her latest obsession. He received escalating warnings, each more absurd than the last. One accused him of floral provocation. Another claimed the flower disrupted the aesthetic continuity of the lakeside homes. When David pushed back, politely but firmly, he was met with threats of daily fines. And when he refused to pay them, things got uglier. It started with small inconveniences. Anonymous complaints about noise that never occurred. Reports of suspicious behavior around his home. Neighbors who once waved now averted their eyes. It was clear Margaret had begun a whisper campaign, a slow poisoning of perception. She had the HOA mailing list, the meeting notes, and enough influence to make sure that David's name came with an asterisk in every conversation. But David was no stranger to paper trails. 30 years in county records taught him to never trust what people say unless it's signed, dated, and notarized. So he began documenting everything. He installed security cameras discreetly around his cabin. He saved every letter, printed every email, and kept a log of interactions. His folder grew inch by inch, filled with timestamps and cross-reference files. He wasn't planning to fight yet, but if the moment came, he'd be ready. And then came the night of the trash incident. It was just after midnight when the motion light snapped on. David, already up reading in his den, glanced at the security monitor and froze. There, in grainy black and white, was Margaret Thompson herself, dressed in dark clothing, dragging a heavy trash bag onto his porch. She dumped it, knocked over a flower pot, and vanished back into the trees like a petty ghost. When David stepped outside, he found the bag reeking of rotting food, old takeout containers, and broken glass. There was no mistaking the message. That next morning, he filed a report with the sheriff. Nothing came of it. The deputy knew Margaret. Many in town did. She hosted fundraisers for animal shelters and church events. But David wasn't discouraged. He had footage. Evidence. The deputy shrugged and said it might take more. So David gathered more. By spring, his folder had become a binder, then a cabinet. Security footage showed Margaret directing landscaping workers to dig up his mailbox. By mistake, a neighbor's child admitted, on camera, that Mrs. Thompson told her not to talk to the angry man with the flowers. Fines kept coming. $25 for a wind chime. $50 for an unapproved hammock. One citation simply read, "General defiance of HOA tone." And then he found it, the crack in Margaret's armor. While reviewing the original deed to the Pine Lake property, David noticed something peculiar. The land the community rested on, every inch of it, was part of a long-term lease from his own family. His father had never sold the land outright. The HOA governed the homes, but not the ground beneath them. That changed everything. He reached out to his father's old attorney, a meticulous woman named Elaine Sutton. Together, they reviewed the lease. It stated clearly that while homeowners retained rights to their houses, the land remained under the ownership of the Miller estate unless a buyout was completed, something that had never happened. David was, legally, still the landlord. And if Margaret was operating under the assumption that the HOA owned everything, she was wrong and vulnerable. But David didn't act yet. He kept quiet. He continued documenting. Margaret, unaware of the trap she was walking into, grew bolder. She proposed doubling HOA fees, claimed new legal expenses, ordered a new fence built with community money behind her own home. David tracked the funds and noticed something odd. The contractor's checks were made out to a shell company, a fake entity. Margaret was embezzling. With Elaine's help, he built the case. A full forensic accounting revealed over $48,000 in misallocated community funds. Checks written to herself, invoices altered, budgets fabricated. He found forged signatures on board election forms, illegally passed amendments, documents that proved Margaret had assumed presidency under false pretenses, and then he made his move. David called for an emergency HOA meeting, backed by the lease, the financial records, and his lawyer. He knew it would be contentious, but he also knew something else. People were tired. Tired of being afraid to plant flowers or leave a lawn chair out overnight. Tired of living under someone else's thumb in a place they were supposed to call home. The room was packed. Margaret, smug and dismissive at first, took her place at the head of the table. But her confidence eroded as David calmly laid out his case. He projected the financial records, played the security footage, read from the lease. He spoke not with rage, but with precision. And when it was over, there was silence, followed by outrage. Residents turned on Margaret. Voices once muted by fear rose together, demanding answers, demanding justice. She tried to shout over them, to twist the narrative, but it was too late. The vote to remove her passed overwhelmingly. She stormed out, face white with fury. But the sheriff's deputies were waiting outside with a summons. In the days following the emergency HOA meeting, Pine Lake felt like a town waking from a long, uneasy sleep. The energy was cautious, like people stepping out after a storm, checking for broken windows and downed branches. Margaret Thompson was gone, at least for the time being. Her name no longer appeared in HOA correspondence, and the sting of her reign, while still fresh, was beginning to fade from the neighborhood's collective spirit. But the damage she left behind wasn't just financial or procedural. It lived in the wary glances neighbors exchanged, in the hesitancy to speak too loudly during backyard conversations, in the unspoken fear that another tyrant might rise from the ashes. David understood this. He wasn't interested in replacing Margaret. He wanted to dismantle the system that allowed someone like her to gain so much unchecked power in the first place. The first step was to address the financial wreckage. With the help of Elaine Sutton and 2 forensic accountants, David presented a full audit to the community during a follow-up meeting. The numbers were staggering. Over 4 years, Margaret had siphoned nearly $50,000 from the HOA account. She had set up fake maintenance companies, Emerald Shore Groundskeeping, Lakeside Legal Consultants, and issued regular payments to accounts under her control. She filed invoices for work that was never done, funneled funds into a personal credit line, and even used HOA money to pay for a trip to Palm Springs under the guise of attending a regional housing governance conference. When the scope of her deception was revealed, residents were stunned. Some had been loyal supporters of Margaret, not because they liked her, but because they feared her. Now, that fear had evaporated. What remained was a sense of collective betrayal. People who once turned a blind eye to her harassment of David now realized they, too, had been pawns in her game. The HOA board was disbanded that night by unanimous vote. The sheriff's department launched a formal investigation the next morning. Margaret, already served with civil subpoenas, was now the subject of a criminal probe. She was charged with fraud, misuse of community funds, document forgery, and harassment. Her home was searched, and investigators found stacks of falsified records, fake HOA ballots, and even a notebook that cataloged complaints against residents she considered non-compliant. David was asked to testify. He agreed, not out of vengeance, but out of principle, but justice wasn't the end goal. Restoration was. With Margaret removed and the HOA structure temporarily suspended, the community was faced with a question that had long been buried under bureaucracy. What kind of place did they want Pine Lake to be? David didn't want to lead, but others insisted he stay involved. And so he agreed to help, but not alone. Enter Mrs. Rosa Garcia, a retired schoolteacher who had lived in Pine Lake for over a decade. Kind, organized, and respected, Rosa had kept her distance from HOA politics for years. But something about David's courage, his meticulous fight for fairness, stirred her. She offered to serve as interim president while a new board was formed, one with transparency rules, term limits, and full public accountability. The community voted overwhelmingly in her favor. David and Rosa worked side by side, not as rulers, but as facilitators. Their first act was to reduce HOA fees by nearly 40%. Without Margaret's administrative costs and shell companies bleeding the budget, it turned out the community had more than enough money to cover real maintenance. David proposed publishing monthly financial reports on a public bulletin board and email list, so no resident would ever again have to wonder where their fees were going. They also revised the HOA regulations from top to bottom. Out went the obscure, putative clauses. No more restrictions on flower types, or porch furniture, or garden decorations. No more citations for wind chimes or patriotic flags. In their place came a one-page code of respect, common-sense rules about noise, littering, and safety. Everything else was left to personal judgment, with the assumption that neighbors could talk to each other like adults, not rely on anonymous complaints and threats. The results were immediate. People started talking again. Children played in yards without worry. Sunflowers bloomed on porches, and no one blinked. The isolation that Margaret had carefully cultivated dissolved almost overnight. A Saturday picnic turned into a block party. Someone set up a little free library by the mailboxes. Someone else started a garden sharing network. The sense of community, long suppressed under Margaret's iron hand, came rushing back like water through a broken dam, and David, ever watchful but no longer burdened, became something of a local legend. Word of what had happened at Pine Lake spread quickly. First, the county paper ran a piece titled, "From Tyranny to Transparency, One Man's Fight Against HOA Abuse." Then came local radio, then TV interviews. David found himself telling the story again and again, each time emphasizing not just what Margaret had done, but how residents, when armed with the truth, had reclaimed their homes and their voices. Soon, messages began pouring in. Emails, letters, phone calls from people across the state, even across the country, who had faced similar HOA horror stories. Some were being fined for painting their shutters the wrong beige. Others were being evicted for having emotional support animals or putting up holiday lights before Thanksgiving. The stories were absurd, tragic, and deeply familiar. One night, after a long phone call with a retired couple in Arizona dealing with their own HOA nightmare, David turned to Rosa and said, "We should help them." She smiled and nodded. And so they did. Together, they formed the Pine Lake Homeowners Advocacy Network, a nonprofit dedicated to educating residents about their rights, offering legal referrals, and pushing for state-level HOA reform. With the help of Elaine Sutton, they compiled a handbook, Know Your Deeds, a homeowner's legal toolkit. It became a go-to resource for communities struggling against overreach. David traveled to Sacramento to testify before a state legislative committee reviewing HOA law. He spoke with clarity and urgency about the need for oversight, transparency requirements, and protections for residents facing retaliation. Lawmakers listened. And 6 months later, a new bill, the Homeowner Protection and Transparency Act, passed with bipartisan support. It mandated financial audits for HOAs, required public election oversight, and capped fines without due process. Pine Lake became the poster child of reform. What was once a tiny lakeside community, nearly choked by control, now stood as a symbol of what could be accomplished when residents took their power back. But for David, the greatest reward wasn't the headlines or the legislation. It came one sunny morning, about a year after Margaret left. He walked out to his porch and saw children laughing on the dock, an elderly couple planting herbs in a shared garden box, and Rosa Garcia leading a community art project. A row of sunflowers danced in the breeze, planted not just on his property now, but in nearly every yard. A quiet protest turned into a community-wide celebration of rebirth. There was no plaque, no parade. Just peace. David sat back in his chair, a mug of coffee in hand, and breathed in the clean air. The war was over. The land was still his. But now, so was the trust of the people who lived upon it. And that made Pine Lake more than just a place on a map. It made it home. David Miller didn't set out to be anyone's hero. He didn't wake up wanting to dismantle a corrupt system or stand at the center of a national movement. But movements, like wildfires, often start from something small, something overlooked. A match, a flicker, a sunflower. And from that sunflower came something few could have imagined. A revolution. It had been just over a year since Margaret Thompson's grip on Pine Lake was broken. The story had gone viral, not in a TikTok sensationalized way, but in a deeply human one. People across the country, many of them older, silenced, financially drained, or emotionally exhausted, saw themselves in David. They watched footage of him calmly exposing corruption, listened to clips of HOA meetings where he quoted the law with quiet precision, and they saw what it looked like to win. Not in a courtroom drama kind of way, but in a way that mattered. Reclaiming dignity, neighborhood, and voice. Media networks kept calling, but David turned down most of them. He wasn't after publicity. He preferred to stay in Pine Lake, walking the wooded trails near the lake with his dog Cooper, sipping coffee on the porch, and working quietly with Rosa Garcia and the small but passionate team they had built. The Pine Lake Homeowners Advocacy Network, or FAN as people had started calling it, was growing faster than they could have imagined. What began as a binder of documents and a few legal tips had become a lifeline for thousands. They received hundreds of letters each week. Stories came in from gated communities in Florida where disabled veterans were being fined for installing ramps. From rural subdivisions in Texas, where widows were being evicted over unapproved rose bushes. From Nevada, New Jersey, Ohio, and even Alaska. The HOA problem wasn't regional. It was systemic. A patchwork of privatized governance with little oversight, too much power in the hands of the wrong people, and nowhere near enough accountability. David read every letter. He couldn't help himself. Some made him angry, others broke his heart. There was the single mother in Tennessee who was fined for having a swing set that didn't match architectural style guidelines. A grandfather in Oregon who was denied access to his own home after a paperwork mix-up left him locked out during a snowstorm. These weren't just HOA complaints. They were stories of isolation, exploitation, and fear. Stories that echoed his own. Rosa suggested they start hosting monthly virtual workshops. At first, they drew just a few dozen people. But by the third month, over 10,000 had signed in. David wasn't a polished speaker, but people loved him for that. He was calm, precise, sometimes even funny. He walked attendees through deed language, exposed tricks HOAs used to suppress dissent, explained the difference between governing documents and legal title rights. It was dry stuff, but when he spoke, people leaned in. They knew he was the real deal. Eventually, a PBS documentary crew arrived. They filmed interviews with Pine Lake residents, documented the transformation, and aired the story under the title, Common Ground, The Fight for Home. It was an unexpected hit, nominated for an Emmy in the local documentary category. David, reluctantly, attended the ceremony, dressed in a borrowed suit and feeling awkward, but when the documentary won, and the auditorium stood applauding, he felt something shift. Not pride exactly, but gravity. This wasn't just about Pine Lake anymore. It was bigger. And it wasn't over. Then the letter arrived. It came from Washington, D.C., from the office of Senator Carla Medina, a young progressive lawmaker from Colorado who had been following Fann's work. She invited David to speak at a policy summit focused on property rights and housing reform. He hesitated. Public speaking on Capitol Hill was far from his comfort zone. But Rosa gave him the look, the same one she had used when she pushed him to plant that first community garden, and said, "It's not about comfort. It's about consequence." So he went. Washington was a world apart. Suits, media flashes, tightly timed schedules, layers of security. But when David took the podium in that crowded chamber, surrounded by staffers, lawyers, and housing policy experts, he didn't stumble. He told the story of the sunflower. Of being fined, harassed, isolated, and finally victorious, not because of a title or money, but because of documents and facts and neighbors who chose courage over convenience. He spoke for 20 minutes. When he finished, the room was silent for a moment. Then applause. Real applause. What followed was months of legislative drafting. David worked as an unpaid consultant for the committee, helping shape what would become the HOA Homeowner Protection and Rights Act. The bill proposed sweeping changes, mandatory transparency reports, state-level HOA oversight boards, limits on fine enforcement, public arbitration options, and protections for whistleblowers. It also included one of David's personal requests, a Homeowner Bill of Rights, posted in every HOA-managed community across the U.S. But political wheels turned slowly, and not without friction. HOA lobby groups pushed back hard. They claimed the bill would cause administrative chaos, that it was anti-homeownership, even a threat to American suburbia. They aired ads showing perfectly trimmed lawns and cheerful board meetings, warning of outside interference. David watched, unfazed. He knew the truth wasn't glossy. It was granular, hidden in footnotes and forged ballots. In the midst of the growing national debate, something unexpected happened back in Pine Lake. Someone dug up Margaret's old house. Literally. A new resident had purchased her abandoned property and during landscaping, unearthed a steel lockbox buried under a flagstone patio. Inside were dozens of documents, some familiar, others not. More falsified ballots, detailed financial logs, and one shocking discovery: Margaret had been in contact with a shady legal consultant in a nearby county, someone who specialized in HOA restructuring. It appeared Pine Lake wasn't her first attempt at authoritarian control. It was her most successful. Rosa and David pored over the files, and the pieces clicked into place. Margaret had been part of a network, small but effective, of rogue HOA consultants who taught aspiring board members how to consolidate power, silence opposition, and rewrite bylaws under the radar. It wasn't just a personality flaw. It was a playbook. This revelation reignited national interest. Journalists began connecting similar cases across the country. Stories surfaced of board members trained in the same methods. One HOA president in Arizona was charged with racketeering. Another in Georgia resigned amid a financial audit. The dominoes began to fall. Meanwhile, Pine Lake had become more than a case study. It had become a movement hub. Advocacy chapters started in over 40 states. The Fan Legal Fund helped residents sue corrupt boards and win. David now worked full-time, unpaid, fielding cases, writing guides, and giving workshops. His days were long, but fulfilling. But with influence came risk. Late one night, David received a voicemail. No name. Just a clipped voice warning him to back off the national stuff or things might get messy. It didn't shake him. He'd faced worse. But when Cooper, his dog, went missing for 12 hours the following week, only to be found tied to a stop sign miles from home, he knew the stakes had changed. Still, he didn't stop, and neither did Congress. After intense debate and public pressure, the HOA Homeowner Protection and Rights Act passed the House. The Senate vote was closer. Tense. But when it finally cleared, the room erupted in celebration. The president signed it into law 6 weeks later, with David standing beside her. Pine Lake held a quiet party that evening. No banners. Just neighbors, bonfires, kids roasting marshmallows. David sat beside Rosa, watching the lake shimmer under the moonlight. It had taken 3 years. Countless hours. Moments of fear, doubt, hope. But now, the law was real. The movement had won. Still, David knew the work wasn't over. The law could help, but culture would take longer. There would always be those who craved power, who twisted rules to serve themselves. But now, there was a blueprint for resistance. A path forward. The next morning, a little boy named Jacob handed David a drawing. It showed a cabin, a sunflower, and a smiling man holding a toolbox and a book. Above it, in messy handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for fixing the neighborhood." David smiled. Maybe that's all it ever was. Not a fight. Not a revolution. Just fixing what was broken. One rule, one neighbor, one sunflower at a time. The weeks after the legislation passed were something of a blur. David tried to return to normal life, or at least what passed for normal in a post-victory Pine Lake. But something had shifted. Not just in the laws, or the community, or even in David's daily routine, but in David himself. The man who once longed for nothing more than a quiet retreat by the lake now found himself traveling, speaking, consulting with policymakers, and fielding media requests from New York to Seattle. He turned down most of them, but not all. When 60 Minutes asked for an exclusive segment on "The Man Who Beat the HOA Machine," David reluctantly agreed, but only if the focus remained on the people, on the stories that brought the movement to life. The segment aired on a Sunday evening and quickly became one of the most watched pieces of the year. Clips went viral. Young TikTok creators, who had never worried about property law, suddenly started doing "Know Your Rights" breakdowns, stitching David's interview with their own neighborhood horror stories. 1 week later, a group of college students in Pennsylvania launched an app called Deed Check, a crowdsourced, HOA-focused tool where homeowners could scan their HOA rules, check their legal standing, and compare them to state law and precedent. It went from 500 users to 50,000 in 2 months. David wasn't involved in the app, but the founders sent him a message thanking him for the inspiration. They called him the accidental architect of HOA transparency. The phrase stuck. Soon, David's influence extended beyond just HOAs. County zoning boards began revisiting their policies, examining how closely they worked with private community associations. State real estate commissions initiated reviews into how HOAs disclose power during property sales. Even homeowner insurance providers began pushing for reforms. After all, fewer abusive fines and forced evictions meant fewer costly lawsuits. Still, for all the progress, the movement wasn't universally loved. There were counterforces. A coalition of developers and corporate landlords formed an opposition group called Protect Our Neighborhoods. Their pitch was fear-based, that removing HOA power would lead to unregulated chaos, overgrown lawns, abandoned vehicles, declining home values. They lobbied aggressively. They ran ads filled with visuals of deteriorating properties and alleged post-HOA collapse zones. David and Rosa knew the fearmongering wouldn't go away. But they also knew the facts told a different story. In Pine Lake, property values had risen 18% since the reforms. Crime remained virtually non-existent. Community satisfaction was the highest it had ever been, based on an independent study by a regional urban planning department. With transparent rules, cooperative governance, and shared decision-making, Pine Lake had become more than just functional. It had become desirable. Rosa's leadership was a huge part of that. Though she still considered herself a retired schoolteacher with a clipboard and a calm voice, her leadership style drew praise from planners across the country. She held open forums every quarter, ran every meeting on time, and implemented a policy where every community proposal, no matter how minor, was posted on a communal discussion board for 5 days before any vote. The motto on the community banner, once a stiff, "Preserving Pine Lake's Legacy," now read, "Shared Land, Shared Life." David remained her close advisor. But increasingly, he spent time helping others. A call from a family in Houston took him to Texas, where a Vietnamese immigrant couple was facing forced removal after repainting their shutters a non-standard gray. He visited a low-income community in North Carolina where HOA fines had become a revenue stream, targeting single mothers and elderly residents. He even helped an indigenous community in New Mexico negotiate with a private HOA that had illegally encroached on sacred land under the guise of landscape management. In every place, he brought the same thing: knowledge, calm, and documentation. But the travel, the appearances, and the constant flow of crisis began to wear on him. For the first time, he felt tired, not the kind of tired that sleep could fix, but the kind that came from carrying too many stories, too much hope, and too much expectation. One evening, while sorting through a pile of letters from supporters and petitioners, he came across one with no return address. Inside was a single note, handwritten, shaky script. "Thank you. You didn't just save our home. You saved us from believing we were powerless." David stared at the letter for a long time. He placed it in a small wooden box beside his father's compass and a photograph of his mother. That box sat on the mantel of his cabin, next to a tiny ceramic sunflower made by a child from the neighborhood. He thought of retiring again, stepping back, letting the movement move without him. But fate, as it so often does, had other plans. A legal challenge was brought against the HOA reform law by a group of private investors in Florida. The case made its way through the courts and, after months of procedural wrangling, was set to be heard by the U.S. Supreme Court. The challenge focused on a narrow clause regarding state versus private governance authority, but the consequences could be devastating. If overturned, the entire national reform framework could unravel. David was not a lawyer, but the legal team handling the case requested he submit a formal amicus brief, a friend of the court statement from someone whose experience illustrated the real-world need for reform. He agreed, and, at the urging of Rosa and Elaine Sutton, he attended the hearing in person. It was surreal. Sitting in that chamber, flanked by marble columns and robed justices, his voice echoed not from his own mouth, but from pages read by a clerk. His story, once a sunflower on a porch, now part of the national legal record. When the decision was announced, months later, it came with a 5-4 vote in favor of upholding the reform law. The opinion cited the need for a balanced structure of homeowner governance that does not erode constitutional protections or due process. David's name appeared in the decision as an illustrative case of homeowner disenfranchisement. The victory was total. But David didn't celebrate with champagne or a press conference. He returned to Pine Lake that night, walked the trail past the dock, and sat by the lake as the sun dipped below the pines. Cooper lay beside him, and the air buzzed with quiet. The wind rustled the trees. A fish jumped in the distance. This, David thought, is what it's all for. In the months following the Supreme Court decision, things began to settle again, though not quite the same way they had before. The fire that sparked from one man's quiet defiance had spread so far, so fast, it no longer needed David at the center to keep it alive. And for David Miller, that was both a relief and a sign. The movement could finally outgrow him. That was the point all along. Still, Pine Lake kept him grounded. He walked the community often, hands in his jacket pockets, nodding to neighbors who now smiled not out of obligation, but out of genuine respect. Kids waved to him as he passed, calling him Mr. Sunflower as a nickname. Someone even spray-painted a small mural on the side of the old tool shed near the community garden. A painted sunflower, roots reaching down into a gavel and deed, with the words, "Planted by Truth." David smiled every time he passed it. Rosa Garcia, whose leadership had proven equal parts compassionate and ironclad, announced that she would step down at the end of the year. She had led Pine Lake through the most turbulent period in its history, and had no desire to rule indefinitely. Her final act as president was a masterstroke of legacy. She led the formation of a community stewardship council, a rotating 5-person board selected by public draw every year, with limited powers and mandatory transparency sessions. "No more kings or queens," she joked. "Just gardeners of this place." Rosa nominated a young woman named Jamie Gwynn as her replacement. Jamie was in her early 30s, a former housing justice organizer who had moved to Pine Lake after watching the PBS documentary and falling in love with the idea of living in a community that had wrestled with power and come out stronger. Jamie brought with her a fierce intellect and a calming presence, and most importantly, a deep belief in continuing the legacy while modernizing its mission. Jamie's first major initiative was the Pine Lake Exchange, a volunteer-run mutual aid system where residents could offer or request help, rides, food deliveries, tutoring, elder care, through a community platform. It was a return to neighborliness, but formalized in a way that was accessible and scalable. David watched the system launch from the sidelines and offered help when asked, but Jamie knew not to lean on him too heavily. "You've already done your part," she told him. "Let us carry it now." One rainy afternoon in the fall, David sat down with Rosa, Jamie, and a documentary filmmaker who had returned to shoot a sequel episode. They recorded a roundtable conversation, not as activists or experts, but as neighbors. Rosa spoke about fear giving way to courage. Jamie talked about how systems need people to bend them back toward justice. And David, quiet for a long moment, finally said, "You know, people talk about freedom like it's just something written down. But it's not. It's where you live. It's the space between your door and your mailbox. It's the right to plant something and know no one can rip it out just because they don't like it. It's not loud. It's quiet." Real freedom is quiet. The crew went silent. The camera kept rolling. That quote, simple, unpolished, became the final line of the documentary. It aired a few months later under the title, Planted, the Pine Lake Story. It wasn't just about the fight anymore. It was about what came after. The rebuilding. The rerouting. The quiet freedom David described. A month after the sequel aired, David received an unexpected package in the mail. Inside was a hand-carved wooden box with an inscription, "For when the work is done." Inside it was a single polished stone, a metal plaque, and a letter from a woman named Teresa who lived in Wisconsin. Her community had used fans' legal templates to remove their abusive board, inspired by Pine Lake. They had voted to rename their Central Park. It was now called Miller Commons. David wept. It was the first time in years he let himself feel the full weight of what had happened. Not just the struggle, not just the victory, but the impact. Quiet letters. Children's drawings. Laws passed. Park names changed. All of it rooted in that one small act, refusing to ask permission for a sunflower. He decided then that it was time to let go. The next community gathering, a celebratory picnic held near the newly restored boathouse. David stood up to speak. His voice was steady, clear. "I came back here looking for quiet," he said. "I found a fight. And now I have found peace again. Not the kind I had before. A better kind. A peace we earned." He thanked the community, hugged Rosa, shook Jamie's hand, and walked off stage with Cooper by his side. 2 weeks later, he submitted paperwork officially retiring from the Pine Lake Council. The cabin remained his home, but now he spent his days writing, slowly, carefully, working on a book about the journey. Not a manifesto. Not a how-to guide. Just a story. A story about sunlight, soil, truth, and a stubborn will to stand. He titled it Roots of Resistance. Publishers came calling quickly. Some wanted a Hollywood deal. One even proposed turning the story into a dramatized streaming series. David declined most of it. He agreed to publish the book on one condition, that half of all profits go directly to the Fan Legal Fund and the Pine Lake Exchange. The book sold over 500,000 copies in its first year. By the second year, Fan had opened regional offices in 6 states. They hired lawyers, paralegals, and field organizers. They won over 200 cases on behalf of homeowners, filed class action suits against fraudulent developers, and trained hundreds of volunteers. David no longer ran the operation, but his philosophy was embedded in every office wall. Document everything. Respect everyone. Know your land. Share your power. In the end, Pine Lake wasn't just saved. It was reborn. Children who grew up in Pine Lake learned to ask questions, not out of defiance, but out of curiosity. Elders gathered not just to reminisce, but to plan, to teach. The community garden expanded, hosting school visits and seed exchanges with neighboring towns. Every year, on the anniversary of the emergency HOA meeting that changed everything, the town held Sunflower Day. People planted new rows together. No regulations, no approvals needed. Just soil, hands, and sunlight. David, in his later years, still attended the events. Still walked the lake. But more than anything, he watched as a single act of resistance became a movement. Watched as a neighborhood found its voice. Watched as people learned that freedom, real freedom, isn't loud or flashy. It doesn't come with parades or speeches. Sometimes, it looks like a flower standing tall on a quiet porch,